Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Rita. I'm the Director of Data Strategy and Analytics at the UN Refugee Agency in the United States. I'm joined at ODSC today with my colleague Frank, who's our data scientist at that agency. It is such a pleasure to be here today. I am highly aware of the level of talent in the room, so it is humbling to be asked to present to so many talented data practitioners today. I am not here to teach data science or analytics, as you are all very qualified. But I am here today to give you a flavor of the importance of your work and the good things that can be done with your talents, if applied to humanitarian crises like the global refugee crisis. I will begin with introducing you to the global refugee crisis, followed by an introduction to the UN Refugee Agency in the United States, and introduce you to the Hive, followed by sharing some examples of how we're applying data science to the refugee crisis, and ending with a glimpse of what's to come. I want to open with a historical example, Alan Turing. Turing is widely known as the father of theoretical computer science and artificial intelligence. Among his many accomplishments, Turing is known for playing a pivotal role in cracking the intercepted coded messages that enabled the Allies to defeat the Nazis that shortened the Second World War in Europe by more than 2 years, saving over 14 million lives. Turing was trying to solve a code for the Allies to win the war during a time of mass exodus of forcibly displaced people. He is one of the first known examples of the concepts of algorithm and computation being applied on the world stage to solve a world problem, the Second World War. I share this example to draw your attention to highlight two parallels. First, the application of theoretical concepts of algorithms on the world stage to solve a world problem. And second, to highlight a pivotal time when the world saw the largest population of displacement people globally in modern history, until today. The big question the UN Refugee Agency in the United States is asking is, can we crack the code around the support for refugees here in the US? Can we apply data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence to address the crisis? Today, the world is facing the most significant refugee crisis since the Second World War. Refugees now number 65 million globally, and an additional 34,000 people flee their homes each day due to war, conflict, and persecution. The global population of refugees is only poised to grow. Addressing the crisis will require participants from all sectors to work together to develop new and innovative solutions through a shared commitment of a joint purpose of business and change. People understand the significance of the Second World War, but not many people understand the significance of the global refugee crisis. I'm going to try, in the next few slides, to share the scope of the crisis, as the numbers are staggering and unimaginable. To start to understand the problem, let's start with who the UN Refugee Agency protects and cares for. UNHCR provides vital assistance to 5 groups: refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced, stateless people, and other people of concern. To many, including myself initially, we look at refugees and we do not see the difference among these different groups, but there are some key differences. Refugees have been forcibly displaced by war, conflict, and persecution, and have crossed an international border. Internally displaced people have been forced to flee their homes, but have not crossed an international border. Then there are people without a nationality that struggle to realize their fundamental human rights and access to basic service. They are stateless. Meanwhile, there are asylum seekers who are in the process of filing for refugee status. And then there's everyone that doesn't fall into these categories, who are other people who are vulnerable and have nobody left to turn to. And of course, then there are those that have returned, the returned refugees and internally displaced. Collectively, these 5 groups have grown since the UN Refugee Agency's formation in 1950, from 2.1 million to over 65 million over the course of 64 years. That's 65 million. The 65 million forcibly displaced population comes from 15 active refugee emergencies out of the 63 countries covered. I wish I had time today to share with you background on all of these refugee situations, as they are of equal importance. But today I've only featured 3: Syria, South Sudan, and the Mediterranean refugee situation in Europe. The first crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, is perhaps one of the most well-known crises taking place today. The Syrian crisis woke up the world to the global refugee crisis in 2015, when one of the most influential images of Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian boy washed ashore on the Turkish coast, hit the world and woke up everyone. This image outraged the world and daylighted the dangerous flight thousands take across the Mediterranean daily. In total, there are 5 million refugees that have fled Syria since 2011, seeking safety in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, and beyond. This crisis has given rise to Europe's refugee situation, or the Mediterranean situation, the next emergency I will highlight. The Mediterranean situation is the increasing trend of sea arrivals of refugees to Europe. Over 1 million people arrived by sea in 2015 to Europe, which is the equivalent of the entire population of Dallas crossing the Mediterranean. In 2016, of the 355,000 sea arrivals, over 1/3 of them, or over 100,000, are unaccompanied children under the age of 17. Thousands are taking this perilous journey because they have no other choice. And often we have seen these images from these past couple years in particular in our news channels, on social media, in our news feeds. It's leading to catastrophic consequences, as we have seen. Another overshadowed refugee situation is South Sudan. The South Sudan conflict has further intensified since the violent July 2016 Juba clashes, leading to over 4 million people displaced. Since the December 2013 civil war, there continues to be an exodus of refugees into neighboring countries that are underserved, like Uganda, the DRC, and Ethiopia. These underserved countries are accepting people at an alarming, unsustainable rate, generating Africa's largest scale refugee crisis today. Alarmingly, 4.8 million people in South Sudan, or more than 1/3 of their total population, are food insecure. That is the equivalent of the entire population of Los Angeles not having access or availability to nutritious food. And over 80% are women and children under the age of 17. Now, these are just 3 emergencies out of the 15 that I've showcased that showcase the magnitude of displacement today. The 15 refugee emergencies have produced over 65 million forcibly displaced people, and this map shows where they reside as of the end of 2015. The size of the circles indicate them are in millions. The colors symbolize the different refugee populations of concern, with pink being refugees and green being internally displaced people. UNHCR has provided these statistics on their website, and I encourage you to visit the site for more information if you're curious to see how the populations have changed over time and where the migrations have taken place. The data is compelling. I myself have spent hours examining these time series and trying to comprehend the bigger picture of the challenge that we are facing today together. There is a lot of data available. Often it is hard to decipher the gravity of the crisis. So my team and I have summarized some figures at a glance for you today. Of the 65.3 million displaced people, almost 4 in 10 are being hosted in the Middle East and North Africa. Over half of the refugees are from Somalia, Afghanistan, and Syria. Meanwhile, Turkey, Pakistan, as well as Lebanon are the top hosting countries in the world. Lebanon has accepted 1.1 million people, which is a startling number when you think of their total population being around 6 million. 24 people around the world are displaced every minute. By the time we finish this 40-minute session, 960 people will have been forced to flee their homes. And over half of the world's refugee population are children. And for this reason, and for many other reasons, I work at the UN Refugee Agency in the United States. The agency is trying to crack the code and solve the largest displacement since the Second World War. We have restarted 50 million refugees' lives since its formation in 1950. USA for UNHCR is the national partner of the UN Refugee Agency in the United States. Through fundraising, advocacy, innovation, and private sector engagement, we help raise funds to make this life-saving assistance possible. There are 9,700 UNHCR employees that work in 128 countries, with 90% working in the field, many in remote and dangerous locations. When an emergency strikes, UNHCR mobilizes aid within 72 hours for the 5 groups that I mentioned earlier. During times of displacement, we provide critical emergency assistance in the form of clean water, sanitation, and healthcare, as well as shelter, blankets, household goods, and sometimes food. We arrange transport and assistance packages for people who return home, and income-generating projects for those who resettle. How does the UN Refugee Agency's work get financed? UNHCR is almost funded entirely by voluntary contributions, with 86% from governments in the European Union, 6% from intergovernmental organizations and pooled funding mechanisms, while a further 6% come from the private sector, including foundations, corporations, and the public. And it is that 6% in green that I would like to draw your attention to, as that is the segment that USA for UNHCR and you and I relate to. In the United States, there are 320 million people around there. Based on our research of philanthropic giving in the US, nonprofits, standard marketing, and fundraising practices reach a small segment of the US population. About 20 million, or 6% of the population, donate to humanitarian causes today, as shown as the red segment on the chart. I will refer back to that red segment throughout the presentation. Nonprofits all know how to find these donors, this small 6%. We look at our existing donor file and we target based on their shared demographics and psychographic variables. But there are millions of Americans who behavioral analysis shows are primed to be engaged around the crisis if given the right access points. And in this segment, we believe we can crack the code on unlocking engagement in the United States. So the big question is, how do we grow that small red segment, that 20 million? How do we engage Americans outside of that group that's already socially conscious and in donating to humanitarian causes today? Money alone will not fix this crisis. We are not going to be able to finance 65 million people returning back to their country. So we are going to apply data science, and that's where the Hive comes in. The Hive is a special project of the UN Refugee Agency in the United States. We've been trying to answer that question on how to grow that small red segment, to figure out how to unlock the potential of the US market and reshape the conversation in the United States around the refugee crisis. We are partnering with leading brands, technology companies, and other partners to explore solutions and how the refugee crisis can be solved beyond what is imaginable today. We are trying to close the otherness gap. We tend to treat the next person as the other, when we are more the same than we are different. The Hive has employed data experts to help us understand the current landscape of support and to develop cutting-edge approaches to engagement that allow us to reach and activate new audiences around the crisis. We employ predictive modeling and political-style micro-targeting to develop groundbreaking new models of engagement. Today, I want to give you an overview of how we've implemented data science at the UN Refugee Agency in the United States, transforming ways in which we communicate and engage with audiences in the US. This is just the beginning of our experimentation. 3 big questions that guide our strategies as we design new models of engagement include: how do we get more Americans to engage? What actions will people take that are also constructive? What can we achieve now versus over time? These questions have led us to designing an engagement framework that we have executed over and over again. First, we want to find the right people, the new audiences. Second, we want to reach the right audience in their frame of context or frame of reference that will enable the global refugee crisis to be reframed in a way that will deepen his or her understanding. Third, we want to connect with this new supporter with a tailored call to action that stems from evidence-based segmentation from our data modeling, setting the foundation to engage more effectively and build capacity for action. These three components should lead to activating the right audiences so there is intentional influence and a wide distribution of responsibility across the United States. We take this framework and we employ it over and over again to create ideally a 360-degree view of our supporters, prospects, and donors. All data is captured and coordinated in a central system, our donor database, that allows us to real-time tailor and create real-time tailoring in support of different engagements. It is a constant cycle with no start or end. Each action feeds another, and every time we get smarter on how to engage every supporter who has expressed any level of interest in engaging and supporting the crisis. Using the earlier mentioned framework, the Hive has explored new tools for driving change, including media, culture, products, and intelligence. I will share some of examples of how we've employed these tools shortly. So we have an enormous challenge. We have an engagement framework, data infrastructure, and an agency with 9,700 staff globally. But this has not been enough to date. And so the Hive is exploring a new approach in applying data science. Civis Analytics, the same data architects that served Obama in 2012 and won the election by activating new audiences through persuasion modeling, has helped the UN Refugee Agency in the United States build 5 data models. These 5 models include a lookalike, 3 predictive models, who comprise a group that we call the persuadables, and a non-target model. I will begin with looking at the lookalike model. The data modeling began with Civis Analytics completing a data ingestion of all of our data from disparate sources and unifying the data into one file per record. The records were then matched to a national consumer file, and 50% of them matched to the file. From this match, we then could append demographic variables and identify common attributes among our donors. That is when we learned that the U4U donors are more likely to be women, disproportionately Caucasian, and donors are frequently over the age of 60. So how did we use this information? Well, it gave us the knowledge we needed to build a lookalike model. The lookalike model is key to identifying individuals that look like USA for UNHCR's existing donors. It was built by sampling 50,000 random donors that had matched the file and 50,000 random non-donors. We ran a binary logistic regression to predict whether an individual looked like a current donor. Every individual on the national file received a score from 0 to 1 that estimated their probability of looking like a current donor. The score distribution produced deciles, and we saw that the top 10% of lookalikes had an almost identical distribution to the current donors. And this distribution is shown on the blue bar chart. We use this lookalike model to be a counterpoint in developing new targets. The high model scores, or those that scored high on the lookalike model, would be individuals, for example, that scored 10, 9, or 8. This indicated that they had a high probability of being an existing donor. Meanwhile, a low model score would infer that they did not look like our current donors. Those are the people that we're the most interested in. Those are the people that are outside of the 20 million, or the 6% of the Americans that are currently socially engaged and already donating to humanitarian causes. USA for UNHCR has already built a machine to identify lookalike donors. But the Hive is here today to identify those that are the core supporters, brand recognition, or education. And those collectively, again, make up our persuadables. These persuadables make up our predictive models and provides the organization a predictive roadmap on how to engage new and existing audiences in the United States on an individual and aggregate level by examining their behaviors and attitudes. So what is predictive modeling? Predictive modeling is the process of turning data about individuals into predictions about their behavior. These past behaviors make up a target variable, or the behavior we're trying to predict for others. For example, we want to identify donors. Everything U4U knows about our current donors, whether that be their occupation, age, income, etc., make up the predictors. USA for UNHCR will use these predictors as information for identifying prospective donors. The model applies statistical algorithms to determine the association between the target variable and the predictors. We can then ask questions like, are younger people more likely to support the UN Refugee Agency's efforts? These predictive models help the Hive and USA for UNHCR engage new audiences in the United States. These predictive models provide the bedrock to the Hive's work. The next few slides will explain how the predictive models were built from 2 national surveys that measured USA for UNHCR's awareness, support, and knowledge, and from online persuasion tests that measured the impact of message frames on support in the US. The surveys and online persuasion tests provide the Hive and USA for UNHCR the critical data needed to build these predictive models. In July 2015, we conducted a large-scale national survey to identify likely supporters, those highly aware, and those highly knowledgeable of the crisis. Not surprisingly, 7 in 10 of the respondents had never heard of the UN Refugee Agency, but 6 in 10 supported the agency's efforts. Syria was top of mind. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean and South Sudan crises were not frequently mentioned. In the follow-up survey in 2015 of October, we saw a noticeable shift in support for the US to negotiate with foreign governments to ensure that all refugees who had fled their home country find a safe place to live over other aid options. I should mention that we are in the process of refreshing our model as there's been a shift in political climate since 2015. In addition to the national surveys, we ran an online persuasion test to determine what message frames would garner support for the UN Refugee Agency's efforts. One message that led to more support for increased economic aid to refugees was the fact that more than half the refugees are children. Meanwhile, another message that led to an increase of support for accepting more refugees was the message that refugees have helped shape America, including Albert Einstein. From these surveys and the online persuasion tests, we had a lot of data. What did we do next? We took the survey respondents and we appended demographic information. Because of the large amount of information on each record, we had to narrow the number of variables in the modeling process. We used a technique called lasso to isolate the best variables, ones that added the most predictive power but did not introduce error to the model. We then ran logistic regression on these variables, and we conducted quality checks through cross-validation to make sure that the model did not generalize across different samples and did not overfit. After cross-validating the model, we applied coefficients for each variable to every individual on our national file. This produced a score ranging from 0 to 1 for every individual, indicating their probability that they would give the desired response, and the desired response being engaging and supporting around the global refugee crisis. As you can see from this fictitious supporter, Joe, he would have 5 scores appended to his file as support, contact, awareness, knowledge, and lookalike, in addition to upwards of 1,300 other data points that allow us to have a more complete picture of Joe's supporter. These scores enabled the Hive and the agency to create sizable target audiences once we stacked the models. In the chart, you'll see we took the deciles and segmented our audiences. The core supporters' education and brand recognition score lower on the decile score, as you can see by the red downward arrows. So they do not look like our current donors, but they're high in support, as shown by the upwards green arrows. And these 3 make up our persuadables whom we're targeting. From stacking the models, we are able to identify their segment size. You'll see that we have about 14 million core education and brand target audiences, about 173 are our non-targets, and about 49 look like our current donors. The 173 million is actually a quite significant number. It allows the agency to now not spend more money and not engage these individuals and focus primarily on the 14 million persuadable population. So in summary, the Hive has built a predictive model with the same data practitioners from the 2012 Obama data team. The agency's data model now provides us an unprecedented understanding of about 250 million Americans on their predicted engagement around social issues who are primed for behavior shifts if given the right access point. Paired with an array of publicly available consumer data, the Hive has developed the capacity to match consumer profiles across these attitudinal and persuasion models to characteristics like brand affinity, media consumption, and purchasing behavior on an individual level. We are uniting the products that people buy, the brands they trust, and the issues that most influence their thinking. We are now able to see where our target populations reside and add, again, upwards of 1,300 data points to every supporter that matches to our model. The models are only useful if applied and translated into impactful business practices that lead to a positive return on investment. And when I say positive return on investment, I don't necessarily mean raising more donations. I mean bringing more new people and bringing them into the conversation. There are numerous ways in which we use the model, including identifying new audiences, testing to see whether the predicted matches the actual, engaging in data-driven partnerships, running campaign analysis by matching those that do sign up against our model, and building custom lists that we can then upload into channels such as Facebook. So since the Hive's creation in 2015, we have launched 22 microtests, 2 acquisition pilots, and 2 model experiments. These tests are ways the Hive is trying to unlock support in the United States. This afternoon, I'll only highlight 5 of the microtests where we have applied uplift modeling and used new tools to drive change, to micro-target the persuadables, or the 14 million Americans that are primed to be engaged in the refugee crisis if they are given the right access point. The first example is refugee emojis. Everyone has a smartphone or a mobile device, and emoji use is increasingly popular. There's a data science about emoji use, and I'm not sure if any of you attended the session before mine, but he went into detail of the science behind it. With a partner, we launched a refugee emoji keyboard, a new tool to drive change that shaped the conversation in the United States. We intentionally unbranded the tool, so private and nonprofit alike can have a common language to speaking on the refugee crisis. Rainbow refugees. We know that more people learned about the LGBT movement and became more supportive through watching programs like Modern Family and Will and Grace than what Freedom to Marry and the Human Rights Campaign were saying. We are trying to do something similar. We are looking at all the different ways to connect the refugee theme back to what people are already doing and what has already captured their attention. In doing so, we used LGBT issues on a global scale as an entry point to introduce the global refugee crisis to Americans to build awareness on refugees that flee from persecution due to their sexual orientation. It is illegal to be gay in 77 out of 195 countries. This is an example of a fact and an issue that we use to frame as a frame of reference to invite new audiences to the conversation through micro-targeting. The Major League Baseball playoffs. Sports is another key component of culture. And culture is another tool that I earlier shared that we're using to drive change. During the baseball playoffs, the Hive linked the number of people that are forced to flee to the capacity of a baseball stadium. In 2015, that number was 42,500. These ads were displayed on the screens at the games during a time that they were watching the game and meeting them again in their frame of reference. Another tool that I mentioned is products. When the Pope visited New York in 2015, we engaged faith-oriented audiences and launched a print ad in tandem with a digital campaign promoting Jesus was a refugee bumper stickers on the Pope-mobile of the print ad. It's kind of hard to see, but there is a black bumper sticker in the back of that ad. We displayed this ad and received thousands and thousands of orders for this bumper sticker over the course of three business days. This allowed us to have a data set that we could then learn not only how products change behavior, but also we learned more about faith-oriented audiences that are already mobilized and engaged on the refugee crisis. The final example is mission-driven partnerships. Nearly 40% of CEOs, CMOs, and CDOs report they intend to engage with NGOs in data-driven partnerships in the years ahead to remain nimble, unlock growth, and enable innovation. The social sector, with its expertise in how to drive advocacy, galvanize passion, and motivate societal change, represents a new toolkit for commercial brands that is critical for influencing consumer behavior, in turn their bottom line, but more importantly, to address some of the biggest problems we're facing today. An example of a data partnership that depicts The potential would be the Magic Box, developed by UNICEF, partnering with Google, Telefonica, and Amadeus and IBM. The Magic Box is an open source platform that allows UNICEF to essentially track the outbreak of pandemics, such as the Ebola crisis and Zika more recently. This is just one example of a prototype that can be built. Now imagine if we were able to build a similar tool to better serve those that are forcibly displaced, that could predict the next refugee situation by layering the environmental, migration, health, and other data sources. This is only possible with cross-sector collaboration, because nonprofits, realistically, we do not have the budgets or the talent to make this happen alone. Looking ahead, we need the Turings of the world to help us crack the refugee code. The same sophisticated algorithms that are being used by the private sector to persuade consumers to support their brands are the same algorithms that we need to apply in understanding how to unlock potential in the United States and beyond. We need your expertise on technical machine learning and data science problems in statistics, architecture, design, and systems engineering. We need your help on non-technical problems in strategy, organization design, hiring, and data culture. Old ways will not open new doors. We need new approaches fostered by cross-sector collaboration with industry partners from the private, public, nonprofit alike, through mission-driven partnerships where we can learn more about our 14 million persuadables and invite more people to the conversation, more than the 20 million that are already engaged and in donating to humanitarian causes. This crisis of 65 million globally displaced people presents a challenge to the world, and over half of them are children. This is a time to be fearless, bold, and innovative, and we need your help. I will open the floor to questions. Thank you.
But oftentimes your training set of people who are willing to donate might not be very random to start with. It might be a pretty biased set of people who have been solicited for donations.
That's a great question. I should have prefaced the presentation with, myself, I am not a trained data scientist, but I do have my data scientist with me today. So I encourage you to ask him to get a more complete answer on that. Thank you. Sorry, yes. So they're all micro-tests, which we then will share the results with our parent organization, which is actually based in DC. So we did see one, they were interested initially in the lookalike model to see, is your model actually mirroring our current donors? And what we saw in a recent test was those that were built out of our lookalike model and then served in Facebook were 3 times more likely if you scored a 10 and 2 times more likely if you scored a 9. So there is differentiation between the scores, and it was actually a compelling result, and so now that is being scaled out in that channel. Thanks. Welcome. Yes?
You find a lot of variance in the success rate based on channel origination.
Certainly. The question was, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if we see variance among the different channels in the success rate. Is that correct? Awesome. So we do. Our modeling is built predominantly online. So we are testing different channels. We just recently employed a test with direct mail. We're anxiously waiting on those results. We've only been mostly testing online. And it is a very expensive way of testing, taking predictive modeling and uploading it into Facebook, and it has a very high cost per acquisition. So certainly not a method we see scaling, but great results that we can then apply in other ways. Sorry, yes.
So you identify the most likely donors are Caucasian female. Is that an absolute number, or is it in terms of percentage?
It's percentage, and it's what our current donors look like. But I mean, the reality is to enlarge that pie and the supporters in the pipeline in general. Sorry.
What I meant was that in terms of the whole absolute number, larger than other groups, or is it like the percentage, how many percent of the white that specific group?
Sorry, I'm not.
Versus the minority group. I see what percent within the group.
Sorry, what percent of the group are? Oh, what? I don't know the answer to that question at this moment. Sorry, I probably could very easily answer that question individually after. Thank you. Yes.
You spoke a little bit about how you're kind of creating a target audience and finding a target audience who you know would be more likely to donate. But can you reverse engineer that or organizations out there reverse engineering that and kind of looking into audiences that are least likely to support these initiatives and educate them?
That's, a great question. And we were kind of debating that idea of also, I think a common term used is like a sleeping dog. Like there are some people that you just do not want to solicit, as that would just turn them the other way completely, and if anything, lead to a worse effect. We aren't at this time conducting that research, but that's certainly an area that is worth, particularly with this issue that is very polarizing in the United States in particular. Yeah. Sorry, yes. Yeah.
So I work in reinsurance, and we deal with catastrophic risks. And obviously, like a refugee crisis, to me, seems like a catastrophic risk. So have you ever thought of looking into groups that might be interested from a portfolio perspective that will add those skills of analyzing those risks?
So in the sense of, in this case, taking data from like insurance companies that cover natural disasters and layering that in to understanding the migrations, maybe? Sorry.
Well, it's obviously different models for different situations.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, like a humanitarian crisis would be a sort of, it would have models associated to it, and there's risks associated to it. You can tie that into a reward component. Obviously, that covers you for certain risks. I don't know. It's just
No, that's great. That's a good example, I think, of how cross-sector and in general looking at the problem from another angle would hugely be beneficial, and I'd love to continue that conversation. Thank you. Yes.
It seems like you didn't target people who looked a lot like the current donors. Why is that?
You mean in terms of just the traditional techniques that are used by nonprofits targeting those that look like their current donors? Why is that?
Yeah, like why not target those people that just look like the current donors?
So the lookalike model that I spoke of, why would we use it to target?
Yeah.
Okay. The truth being the predictive models provides a predictive score. And more often than not, those individuals require a longer lead time to show support, whether that be financially or even be engaged. So we choose to use the lookalike model, to raise money essentially. It obviously helps us with segmenting and targeting more effectively. Does that answer your question?
So you're saying it takes longer to get people who look like their other donors to actually donate than it does to convert people who don't look like them?
No, those that are predicted in the persuadable group, that I spoke of earlier in the presentation, that there was a core brand and education. So those are individuals that we know are primed to be engaged in support, but they don't look like our current donors. But they're still people of interest as we want to bring them into the conversation. Did that clarify? Thank you. So are there any, oh, yes, in the back there.
So you talked about doing a number of micro tests with these models that you build. You talked about building models being a relatively expensive investment, and using data science tools is relatively new to a lot of sector organizations. So can you talk a little bit about how you got buy-in from leadership to create a project like this in an organization with history like the UN?
Sure. Great question. His question was related to how did we get leadership to invest in building these models, and in general, also, I don't know, it's not a common, I mean, it's becoming a common structure that we have data science in nonprofits, but certainly there aren't a lot of nonprofits that have the budget either to, have that commitment from the top down. We're lucky in that the CEO and executive director, Anne-Marie Gray, believes in data science, believes in looking at all new innovative ways she can think of on how to address the crisis, given its magnitude. It's not an easy sell, though. I mean, the reality is a lot of nonprofits continue to make most of their revenue off of traditional techniques through like direct mail, which a lot of people continually be surprised by because a lot of people don't now have even a permanent mailing address for a consistent time. So, and telemarketing, which again, people are like, what? Because most people have mobile phones. But this is what, so it's been a bit of it certainly has been a challenge to try to translate the leadership's vision throughout the entire organization, and also to validate the model, because we are still very much at the beginning of testing the model and validating it, and to be able to demonstrate that it is of value. Thank you for the questions. Great. So there's a question in the back there. After maybe this, I'm sorry.
Have you thought about opening your data to something like a hackle competition so you could get people like us helping you with your models instead of just ignore one data scientist?
Yes. Great question. We've been looking at, I'm not too sure, I'm sure maybe some have heard of DataKind. They do hackathons, and so we're looking at ways where we can obviously use other existing kind of events and organizations that are hosting hackathons and so forth, where we can, use the refugee crisis as the problem and building prototypes and what have you. Thank you. And sorry, yes, the one in front.
What outputs from your data science efforts and initiatives do you think would be helpful in seeking those strategic partnerships with the brands? Have you guys gotten that far, or are you just thinking?
It's a concept at this point. We have not, we don't have a fully built out strategy at this point. We are, we have our one-off partnerships. For example, we're working with a Stanford computer science class right now on building a social listening tool. We've been in conversation with UNICEF on their Magic Box. And so there is certainly opportunities there. The challenge, of course, being that our data science or data team is consisting of Frank and I. So there's two of us, and it's a challenge. Yes, a question in the back.
What exactly do people in the existence take to do for that? Are you talking about skills-based volunteering? Do you have projects with Rita? What kind of things do you have?
Well, we would welcome your help in many ways. One, volunteering would be great if if you could look at our data and be like, well, maybe what you're seeing and what we're seeing and what we've hired help to see would be obviously different. That's one thing. Another is we're also always looking at different vendors. The reality being two of us in nonprofit settings, we don't have those expertise in machine learning and all these other technical skills, and that's when we obviously will look outside for that help, for hired. And then, obviously we're always looking to ask individual practitioners in the field as, the new trends and the new tools, and just trying to keep up to date with industry as well. And we're out of time. I would love more questions if you have any at the front. Thank you.